Hello everyone, you're very welcome to the virtual festival of LGBTI plus history, Outing the Past Dublin 2021, hosted by three of the capital's most popular cultural institutions. The National Museum of Ireland, Decorative Art and History, the National Gallery of Ireland, and Kilmainham Jail Museum are delighted to present Outing the Past Dublin 2021, which runs from the 22nd to the 28th of March 2021. The festival aims to bring LGBTI plus history to a wider audience in an exciting, inspiring, and thought-provoking programme of events. As part of the festival programme, I would like to introduce Dr. Rainer Schulze. Dr. Schulze is the founding editor of the journal The Holocaust in History and Memory, and Professor of Modern European History at the University of Essex, UK. Dr. Schulze's presentation explores a generation of gay men who were prosecuted under the Nazi regime. Dr. Schulze will also discuss the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and 1990s to the present, raising awareness of this important period of our recent history, which continues to cast a long shadow on LGBTI plus lives into the present day.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my talk about the pink triangle, its history, its legacy, and its importance in the battle for LGBTQ rights. I will try to get up a PowerPoint, and there it is. So, all good to start. This is Josef Kohut. In March 1939, when he was 22 years old, he was summoned to report to the local Gestapo headquarters. He had no idea why. He was shouted at rather than asked, "You are queer, a homosexual, do you admit it?" He was then forced to sign the prepared confession, and 2 weeks later he was sentenced for homosexual behavior, a 6-month prison term with 1 fasting day per month thrown in for good measure. When he had served his time in prison, he was immediately transported first to Sachsenhausen concentration camp and a year later to Flossenbürg to do slave labor in clay pits and stone quarries. 6 years after his arrest, on the 23rd of April 1945, he was liberated by American troops. This is Klaus Born. When he was 20 years old, he also found himself in trouble with the authorities because he was gay and had engaged in a homosexual act. The year was 1965, and he was sentenced to 6 weeks in prison under the very same paragraph of the German Penal Code that had sent Kohut first to prison and then to 2 concentration camps 25 years earlier. And this is Dennis Akpona. Born and raised in Nigeria, he was outed by one of his friends who had been coerced by the police into naming other gay men. Despite moving address, he was identified, beaten up, and dragged to the police station, where he was arrested and tortured. He spent 4 terrifying days in jail, where he was assaulted by other prisoners before he was able to get out. Eventually, he was granted asylum in the US. Of these 3 men, only Josef Kohut actually wore the pink triangle, the badge that homosexual inmates were forced to wear in a Nazi concentration camp. But all 3, and innumerable others, were and are affected by the same kind of discrimination and persecution solely because they did not and do not fall into the heterosexual norm. Incidentally, no mentioning of women so far, and this is because lesbianism was historically rarely targeted as such, and even more rarely criminalized. And I'll get back to that a bit later. Anti-homosexual legislation did not end with the defeat of the Nazi regime, and it had not started with the Nazis either. In fact, the Nazis could use deep-rooted public attitudes and existing laws for their battle against male homosexuality. Anti-homosexual sentiments and policies had been around for much of the medieval and early modern period, with organized religion one of the main drivers behind it. sex between men, normally defined as penetrative or anal intercourse, was regarded as a capital crime and often resulted in a punishment of death, usually at first by burning and then later by public hanging. England passed the first civil sodomy law in 1533 during the reign of Henry VIII. Until then, it had been a matter of ecclesiastical courts to deal with male homosexuality. An unnatural sexual act against the will of God and man remained a capital offense in England until 1865, although the last executions for sodomy by hanging took place in 1835 in front of Newgate Prison in London. France abolished all provisions criminalizing male homosexuality in 1791 during the French Revolution. But just as in England, in the other countries in Europe, male homosexuality remained illegal, even though the laws were somewhat liberalized, a process which took longer in England. In Prussia, for example, the death penalty was replaced in 1794 by imprisonment between 6 months and 4 years and the loss of civil rights. This provision became law in the German Empire as a whole when Germany was unified in 1871, the infamous paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. However, despite the constant threat of criminalization, something like a gay subculture did develop slowly in many European capitals and bigger cities. Most importantly, perhaps, in the German capital, Berlin. It was here that the first homosexual rights movement in the world evolved, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, founded in 1897 by the physician Magnus Hirschfeld, himself gay and incidentally Jewish. Hirschfeld's motto was "Through science to justice," meaning he used science to campaign for a greater acceptance of homosexuality and a repeal of paragraph 175. And this is a political cartoon from 1907 depicting Hirschfeld drumming up support for a repeal for paragraph 175. After the First World War, whilst male homosexuality remained criminalized, the battles for acceptance and equality continued. In the 1920s, the German capital Berlin became something like a homosexual mecca, where not just intellectuals, artists, and bohemians, but also ordinary gay men, lesbians, and trans people could live relatively open lives. 1920s Berlin had more LGBTQ plus bars than New York in the 1970s. And the most famous one of them was no doubt the El Dorado. And Otto Dix painted quite a few paintings showing scenes from inside the El Dorado, as is seen here on the right. And also Christopher Isherwood visited the El Dorado when he lived in Berlin. And this is reflected in his book, Goodbye to Berlin, which of course was the starting line for the musical Cabaret with Liza Minnelli. In 1919, Magnus Hirschfeld set up the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, the first institute in the world that was dedicated to the research and teaching of all sexual matters. There was also now a broader homosexual organization, the League for Human Rights, which aimed to persuade parliamentarians to change the law, again, using science as the basis of their arguments. And the League for Human Rights was politically so broad that even Ernst Röhm, the leader of the Nazi stormtroopers, the SA, belonged to this reform group. At the end of the 1920s, it even looked for a brief moment as if a repeal of paragraph 175 might find a majority in the German parliament. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, all of this came to a brutal end. Bars and other public LGBTQ plus meeting places were shut down, publications banned, and the result was the destruction of the social networks of all LGBTQ plus people who were increasingly individualized and driven underground. And here you see the El Dorado closed down and adorned with the Nazi swastika. On the bottom left-hand corner is a copy of Der Stürmer, actually from 1929, with propaganda against Magnus Hirschfeld as a Jew and as a gay man. The Jews are our misfortune. And on the 6th of May 1933, only a few months after the Nazi seizure of power, Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science and his private home were ransacked and demolished by students, egged on by the stormtroopers, the SA. This little image here is a clip from a newspaper showing how the students assemble in front of the Institute before they ransacked it. Most of the more than 12,000 books in the Institute's library and a collection of 35,000 pictures were destroyed, together with thousands of other so-called un-German or degenerate books, in the public burning of books in the center of Berlin 4 days later, on the 10th of May. The Nazis regarded homosexual men as enemies of the state and a threat to the recovery of the German national body, the German Volk. Their crusade against male homosexuality was fueled by a mixture of century-old anti-homosexual prejudice and right-wing Völkisch population politics. Population number was seen as key for a folk that strove for greatness, and their inability and/or unwillingness to produce much-needed children for future wars placed gay men outside the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. The crusade against homosexuality was supported by both Catholic and Protestant churches for so-called moral reasons. In 1935, the existing paragraph 175 was revised and amended with a new paragraph 175A to close what was seen as loopholes in the law. Unnatural sexual acts between men could now include any act that might be construed as homosexual, such as embracing or kissing another man, and the courts later ruled that even the mere intent or thought were sufficient for prosecution, and that rumor or gossip were sufficient as evidence. In 1936, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, established a special central office for combating homosexuality and abortion within the Reich Criminal Police Office in Berlin. And one of its main tasks was to set up a central register of all men either sentenced for being gay or simply suspected of being gay. By the spring of 1945, around 100,000 men were listed in their files, the so-called pink files. Making one agency responsible for combating both homosexuality and abortion underlines the priority the Nazis gave to achieving a higher birth rate of its Aryan population. If the authorities claimed that convicted men were likely to reoffend, they were transported to concentration camps following their prison term, and sometimes even before they had completed their prison term. From 1940, this became the rule. In the concentration camps, prisoners were marked according to why they had been sent to the camps by different colored badges, mostly triangles, which they had to wear on their camp uniforms. Initially, those convicted under paragraph 175 were given various forms of identifying badges, including a large black dot, the letter A, or a large 175 on the back of their jackets. Gradually, the pink triangle became the marker that singled out homosexual men. And this is a contemporary poster that was put up in the offices of SS guards. And here you see the pink triangle for homosexual men. The treatment of prisoners in the concentration camps varied considerably according to their category, and gay men routinely suffered greater brutality than members of other prisoner groups, not only by the SS guards, but also by fellow prisoners. Brutal assaults and rapes were not uncommon, and some gay men, especially younger ones, and those who had only recently arrived at the camp, sought the goodwill and protection of capos and other influential prisoners, and also of SS guards, by providing sexual favors, until they were dropped for a new arrival who looked fresher, more healthy, still not marked by concentration camp incarceration. Another route of survival, and possibly even escaping incarceration in concentration camps altogether, was castration, which some Nazi officials advocated as a way of curing homosexuality. Once castrated, many were drafted into penal brigades and sent to fight on the Eastern Front, the Russian front, which amounted almost to a death sentence because so many perished there in the battles. Gay men were also subjected to gruesome medical experiments. Carl Fernet, a Danish doctor, for example, claimed to have found a cure for homosexuality by implanting a capsule which would release the male hormone testosterone. The SS invited him to test this procedure in the concentration camps using the gay men incarcerated there, and those prisoners who survived the procedure could then prove that they were healed of their sexual deviance in the camp brothel set up in many concentration camps with female concentration camp prisoners. And if they managed to perform the sexual act with a woman, some of them were actually released. Incarceration in a concentration camp meant for most gay men a continuation of the individualization and isolation which had begun long before their arrests. The man with the pink triangle came from all ranks of German society. They had had little in common before the concentration camps apart from their sexual orientation, and therefore often found it more difficult than other prisoners to establish forms of solidarity and networks of support amongst themselves, which were vital for survival in the camps. The men with the pink triangle were usually given more grueling and deadly work assignments than other prisoners. They were not exterminated systematically in gas chambers, but murdered by a mixture of total physical exhaustion through terror work, brutal treatment, and malnourishment. And this is often referred to as indirect mass annihilation. Whilst it affected many groups of concentration camp prisoners, it affected homosexual men disproportionately. The precise number of victims of the Nazi crusade against male homosexuality is all but impossible to establish. Estimates are that up to 100,000 men, possibly more, were arrested for offenses against paragraph 175, with about half of them, i.e. around 50,000, actually sentenced. Around 10,000, possibly up to 15,000 of them ended up in concentration camps. It will probably never be known how many of them perished there, as only few documents have survived and historical research has been very limited. What is clear, however, is that the death rate of homosexual prisoners in the camps was among the highest of all victim groups. Perhaps as many as 60% of gay concentration camp prisoners perished, and it was usually very quick. The individual pink triangle prisoner was likely to survive for only a short time in the camp. After 4 months, 1 in 4 had died. After a year, 1 in 2. The Nazis mainly targeted German and after the Anschluss Austrian gay men. Normally, non-German gay men were only arrested and prosecuted under paragraph 175 when they had sexual relationships with a German partner. Most German and also Austrian homosexual men were, in the Nazi definition, Aryans and thus not per se racially inferior or undesirable. The main aim of the Nazi crusade was not so much the actual physical extermination of each individual homosexual man, in contrast to the persecution of the Jews or the Roma and Sinti, where all individual Jews and Roma and Sinti were to be annihilated. In the case of the persecution of gay men, the Nazi aim was the eradication of male homosexuality. This could be achieved through re-education in the form of slave labor in the concentration camp, or through medical treatment in or outside the concentration camp, which would cure their abnormal behavior or at least prevent its manifestation. That was what the Nazis assumed. The Nazis did not target lesbians systematically and did not criminalize female homosexuality. Lesbians were not regarded as a direct danger to the German folk in the same way homosexual men were. This reflected the Nazi view that women were passive and that lesbians could be easily forced to serve as wives and mothers of Aryan children. Only women who proved completely unwilling to conform to family values, often called habitual or incorrectable lesbians, were persecuted. But they were usually arrested as asocials or prostitutes, and if deported to concentration camps, would normally not be given the pink triangle, but instead got the black triangle, which the asocial or work-shy prisoners received. However, all measures taken to combat male homosexuality, such as the closing of LGBTQ+ clubs and meeting places, obviously affected the lives of lesbians as well, destroying equally their social networks and forcing them into unwanted gender roles and relationships. And the image of women that Nazi propaganda postulated made very clear that there was no place for lesbians in the German Volksgemeinschaft, the national community. And it goes without saying that there was definitely no place for trans people either. The arrival of the Allied forces in the first months of 1945 was a moment of liberation for the vast majority of the concentration camp survivors. For many of the men with the pink triangle, however, the end of Nazi rule did not bring freedom. Once the camps were shut down, some homosexual inmates were immediately rearrested as criminals under Allied occupation and sent back to prison if they had not served their full sentence before they had been deported to a concentration camp. And at the very least, all were forced to keep their time in the camps a secret for fear of being rearrested. From the camps, they went right back into the closet. The 1935 version of paragraph 175 was not repealed as a Nazi law by the occupation powers, but remained in force. And the Nazi pink lists of known or suspected homosexual men were handed over to the new authorities, who were happy to make use of them. This is Pierre Seel. In his autobiography, he writes about the day he finally returned home in the spring of 1945. The press was waiting for us at the station. I answered their questions very tersely, for I did not dare reveal everything about myself. I was already starting to censor my memories, and I realized that despite my expectations, despite all the things I had imagined, despite the emotions of my homecoming, which I had looked forward to for such a long time, despite all that, Liberation was only for others. Gay concentration camp survivors were not recognized as victims of Nazi persecution, and they did not receive any compensation for their suffering, as they had not been persecuted on the basis of their race, religion, or political belief, but had been deported to concentration camps following laws that were not regarded as specifically Nazi in character, but that had been part of the German penal code long before the Nazis came to power. And similar laws existed in all Western countries with the acceptance of France. There were few survivors who tried to challenge the view that they were not up for compensation payments, but those remained a very small number, as any attempt to claim compensation would have meant to disclose their homosexuality and could have meant that they would incriminate themselves. Given the continued criminalization of male homosexuality everywhere, it is not surprising that gay men did not speak much about their experiences during the Nazi period, and historians did not deal much, if at all, with this question either. We had no chance to write our own history, and others did not write it for us. They did not even keep any evidence of how gay men were treated. The state, the churches, actually all institutions did everything they could, and they did it very successfully, to keep the wider ignorant public convinced that gay men were indeed criminals and that the Nazis did nothing wrong treating them as such. I still remember that when I was a kid, adults would point to effeminate-looking or acting men and comment that obviously Hitler had overlooked them, a comment that puzzled me at the time and only made sense to me much later, if sense is the right word in this context. As one survivor put it, the fear of arrest and incarceration remained the same in the 1950s and 1960s. The few personal testimonies that we have from this period show how gay men either tried to remain invisible or, possibly worse, live normal lives. They married in order to avoid detection and had sex with men in secret, often with hustlers, making them an easy prey for blackmail or worse. The fear of detection, the fear of losing everything, hung like a black cloud over almost every gay man during this period, and not only in Germany, but everywhere in Europe. It was not a time to talk about the suffering gay men had endured during the Nazi regime, as the suffering for all gay men continued. In fact, in West Germany, between 1949 and 1969, when the law was finally at least partially reformed, over 100,000 homosexual men were placed under legal investigation, and just under 60,000 men were sentenced, getting a criminal record for the rest of their lives. This is actually roughly the same number as were prosecuted or persecuted during the Nazi regime. For most gay men, this daily battle of keeping up appearances cost so much energy that there was hardly any left for political battles. But there were a few courageous people who did speak out against the continued criminalization of male homosexuality. In Britain, there was the Homosexual Law Reform Society, founded in 1958, following the publication of the Wolfenden Report. And in West Germany, there were even two organizations, both trying to continue what Magnus Hirschfeld had started before 1933. All these organizations were basically elite organizations, comprising lawyers and members of the medical profession, and many of them were not even gay. Those who were gay tried to make themselves look respectable. They rejected the term homosexual because of its sexual connotation, and they called themselves homophiles. They thought that this would be less offensive calling themselves homophiles. And they hardly dare to say that they were actually speaking for and about themselves because they feared the consequences. It still took more than 20 years before the first laws against male homosexuality were at least partially reformed. For example, in Britain, this happened in 1967, and in West Germany in 1969, and elsewhere it took even longer. However, the laws were not changed because of gay activism. They were changed because a group of progressive lawyers, supported by members of parliament, realized that the times and social attitudes were changing and that the law needed to change as well to reflect this. But the reform of the law, the partial decriminalization, did not mean that society now approved of homosexuality, as Arthur Gore, the Earl of Arran, who led the effort to decriminalize male homosexuality in England and Wales in 1967, put it in the House of Lords. Homosexuals must continue to remember that while there may be nothing bad in being a homosexual, there is certainly nothing good. The real sea change came only after the reform of the laws in England and West Germany, and it started in New York City with the Stonewall riots in June 1969. This led to the rise of a completely new, a radical gay liberation movement, which did not just want some modest legal reform, but they wanted real and radical social change and freedom for all. In order to provide their battle with a powerful and irrefutable historical and moral foundation, they linked it to the fate of gay men during the Nazi period. Already in their first statement, written down in late 1970 by John Chesterman, London's newly founded Gay Liberation Front issued their freedom call for all humanity explicitly in the name of the tens of thousands who wore the badge of homosexuality in the gas chambers and concentration camps, who have no children to remember them, and whom your histories forget. But what was actually known in the early 1970s about what the man with the pink triangle had endured? Frankly, very little. And the activists of the new gay liberation movements often vastly overestimated, without evidence, the number of gay victims during the Nazi period. And they created parallels with the persecution and extermination of the Jews that did not exist. Like in this quote from the demands of the Gay Liberation Front, which parallels the treatment with the Jews in the word gas chambers. Some gay activists used the term gay Holocaust or Homocaust for the Nazi persecution of gay men, which further obscured the historical reality. The ignorance or confusion over what gay men had endured during the Nazi period is, of course, understandable, as at the time there was so little or no information at all available. The first testimony of a victim of the Nazi persecution of gay men was only published in 1972, a small book titled The Man with the Pink Triangle, written by Heinz Heger. Only the name of the author wasn't really Heinz Heger. Heinz Heger was a pseudonym, as even in 1972, the author felt it was still too dangerous to use his real name. His real name was actually Joseph Kohut, and you will remember that I mentioned him at the beginning of my talk. Playwrights tried to make up for the lack of authentic testimony of gay victims of Nazi persecution by imagining what it could have been like. For example, London's Gay Sweatshop Theatre Company, founded in 1974, produced two notable plays that dealt with this topic. As Time Goes By Noel Craig and Hugh Griffith, first performed in 1976, was set in three locations at three different historical settings: London in the 1890s, Berlin in the 1930s, and New York City in 1969. Much more important was the other play that the Gay Sweatshop produced on this topic, Bent, written by Martin Sherman, himself gay and Jewish, first performed in London in 1979 with the young Ian McKellen as Max, a homosexual man who pretends he is a Jew by wearing the yellow Star of David on his concentration camp uniform. The play moved to Broadway later in the same year, 1979, where Richard Gere played the lead. It was, and still is, an incredibly haunting and moving play. And yet, Bent is also a very flawed play. Dachau, which is the concentration camp where the play is actually set, was not the concentration camp where the majority of gay men were deported to, but it was the name of a concentration camp well known outside Germany. The hard and senseless quarry work depicted in the play happened at other camps. And most importantly, the play's main political message was the message of the day of the early 1970s. The message, be visible, be out, be active, because discreet behavior and remaining in the closet does not make you more acceptable to society or to the authorities. The play proclaimed the need to come out no matter where, even in a Nazi concentration camp, which Max does at the very end of the play. But was this really a fair demand for the Nazi period or any other period where male homosexuality was criminalized? Yet despite all its flaws, Bent, as before as time goes by, made the topic accessible for a younger audience. And above all, those two plays probably did more to spread knowledge about the Pink Triangle than any other publication or pamphlet. Hege's book, The Man with the Pink Triangle, and Sherman's play, Bent, gave huge impetus to reclaiming the Pink Triangle and turning it into a symbol of pride and defiance. In 1973, West Germany's gay liberation group Homosexuelle Aktion West-Berlin became the first gay liberation group in the world to adopt the Pink Triangle as a symbol in the fight for full and equal gay rights. And the Pink Triangle was increasingly now turned around, pointing upwards. A founding member of the West Berlin group later recalled, by wearing the Pink Triangle, we could show that we were gay, so it became a symbol of pride and positive self-identification. However, it also needs to be said that the relationship between the young gay rights activists of the 1970s who reclaimed the Pink Triangle and the older generation who had endured the long period of criminalization for most of their lives, some of whom who had worn the Pink Triangle in the concentration camps, this relationship was always a very uneasy one. The new gay rights movements were bitterly critical of the homophile organizations of the 1950s and 1960s and rejected their cautious approach and politics. Many of the younger activists were more than irritated that the older generation simply refused to come out publicly. And many of the older generation in turn felt rejected, or at least not taken seriously, with their fears and apprehensions and their more careful attitudes, which they had adopted because of their lifetime of experiences of living under a law that criminalized male homosexuality. And these differences between the generations were very difficult to bridge, and they were probably never fully bridged during the lifetime of the older generation. And yet we all, the younger generation of activists, seem to wear a pink triangle on our shirts or coats in those days and carry it around on banners on our demonstration. Here again is the picture from West Berlin. This is Melbourne in 1973, and this is Sydney in 1973. By the end of the 1970s, the pink triangle was widely used as a symbol for gay rights protests and gay memorialization from Europe to the United States to Australia. The pink triangle was used in the political battles of the day. Here we have gays and lesbians against Nazis, the neo-Nazis of the 1970s, the pink triangle destroying the swastika. And here it is used at a pride event, and I think that was Los Angeles, as a background. And this is the cover of Time Out of 1979, the 10th anniversary of Stonewall. And this is Ireland, Dublin. In March 1979, the newly established National Gay Federation, as it was called then, now the National LGBT Federation, opened Ireland's first dedicated full-time community centre at 10 Fowne Street in Temple Bar and named it the Hirschfeld Centre, which soon became just the Hirsch, in honor of Magnus Hirschfeld. And in 1981, a young civil rights lawyer by the name of Mary Robinson unveiled a pink triangle sign outside the centre. Pink triangles were also worn as pins at Ireland's first Pride Week, which took place at the Hirschfeld Centre at the end of June 1979, a few months after it had been set up. And they were used on banners during the Pride Parade since 1983. And pink triangle pins served as a sign of membership of the NGF and the Hirschfeld Centre. The bronze nameplate from the front of the Hirschfeld Centre is now on display in the Little Museum of Dublin, or at least it was when I visited in March 2019. But I was told that the pink triangle disappeared that was in front of the Hirschfeld Centre. This is the house, how it looks now. The original building burned down in 1987. And in 2019, a plaque was unveiled at the old site of the Hirschfeld Centre. The design and layout of the Homo Monument in Amsterdam, which commemorates all gay men and lesbians who have been subjected to persecution because of their homosexuality and which opened in September 1987, is based, as you can see here, on the pink triangle. And pink triangles were also put up at several concentration camp sites, Buchenwald and Mauthausen. And the pink triangle obviously is also the symbol used for a plaque at Berlin's Nollendorf U-Bahn station, which was put up in 1989. In contrast, later monuments, most prominently the monument to the homosexuals persecuted under Nazism in Berlin's Tiergarten, just opposite the Jewish Memorial, which opened in 2008, the gay and lesbian monument, often no longer have a reference to the pink triangle. With the outbreak of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, the pink triangle gained further prominence. In 1987, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, adopted an inverted pink triangle along with the slogan "Silence equals death" as its logo in the battle for more support, more medical treatment for research in the AIDS crisis. But whilst the AIDS epidemic saw an increased use of the pink triangle as a campaigning logo, it also marks an important dividing line in LGBTQ+ history and LGBTQ+ consciousness. The timeline became divided into before and after the onset of HIV/AIDS. The AIDS epidemic became the new Holocaust, the new gay Holocaust. And the men with the pink triangle, the original gay Holocaust, if you so want, and their specific fate in the persecution by the Nazis were moving into the background again, into the shadows, were increasingly forgotten again. Because at around the same time, the rainbow flag slowly rose to become the symbol of LGBTQ+ pride. It was first flown in the San Francisco Gay Freedom Day parade on the 25th of June 1978, just before the onset of HIV/AIDS, at that time still with 8 stripes, with the stripe in so-called hot pink, standing for sex or sexuality, at the top. Now it only has 6 stripes, of course. The rainbow flag expresses how we would like to see ourselves and society at large. It is where we strive to go. The pink triangle stands for the ultimate horror It is the past from which we here in the West have slowly emerged in the last 50 or so years, but which still engulfs many of us all around the world, in Chechnya, in Africa, in Arab Islamic countries, but let's face it, also in Poland, and much closer to home, in many rural areas. The rainbow is the expression of pride and confidence. The pink triangle reminds us as a community where we are coming from, and it symbolizes the battles of liberation which are not yet over. There's no future without knowledge and awareness of the past, and therefore the rainbow flag needs the link to the pink triangle. And here are two examples, two attempts to bring the two together, but they didn't really catch on. In 2012, Los Angeles-based artist Hector Silva tried a different, perhaps more provocative way to link the pink triangle, our tortured past, to our hedonistic presence of a younger generation who is largely unaware of where we have come from. His drawing, Nuestras Historias Plegadas, our pleated histories, combines eroticism and history. It shows a shirtless, muscular, blindfolded man standing behind barbed wire with a pink triangle tattooed on his forearm. He is lowering the left waistband of his community garb, revealing a biohazard symbol, the symbol for the HIV positive community. And he has a body posture expressing defiance. Silva explained, I wanted to bring some of our gay history back to our new generations. I have been talking to a lot of gay youth and other gay people, including gay Latino immigrants, and I've noticed that they don't know about our past and what we've been through to get where we are today. The pink triangle does not only remind us of our past, of where we have come from, it can also link our presence to those countries and regions where our past is still very much the presence of the LGBTQ plus communities. It reminds us that whilst we have come a long way in the last 50 or so years, the past is only a few steps away. The pink triangle is a powerful symbol to create communality and solidarity across borders, across age differences, and across LGBTQ plus divides. The pink triangle is stroppy, it is defiant, it has hard corners, in contrast to the rainbow, which is so cuddly and non-offensive that everyone can easily accept it. With the rainbow flag replacing the pink triangle, an important link to our past, but also to the continuing presence for many LGBTQ plus people around the world, is being lost, without many people even noticing it. I lost my old pink triangle pin some time ago. It just simply disappeared, it walked away. But to my dismay, I found it almost impossible to get a new one. Even in Berlin, when I was looking for one there a couple of years ago, no chance. I found the one that I'm wearing today at a small bookshop in Phoenix, Arizona, of all places. But the young guy at the till had obviously no idea what it was because he asked me, why are you buying this? We forget the past at our own peril. And that is why the pink triangle and what it has come to stand for remains of pivotal importance today, to remind us that the struggle for equal LGBTQ plus rights is not about mirroring existing social structures of the heterosexual world and adhering to the norms of the majority heterosexual society. We have our own history and we want to be accepted on our terms, not if and when we agree to heterosexual social institutions such as the traditional marriage. The pink triangle reminds us of the suffering of our forefathers and of our own radical designs for equality and diversity formulated in the 1970s, based on choice, our choice, which result from our specific experiences. That is why the pink triangle remains of vital importance for our battles.